Wherever you are on your leadership voyage, it starts here.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Leadership Voyage. My name is Jason Wick. You can contact me at startyourvoyage@gmail.com if you have any comments about the show. Otherwise, the website is leadership.voyage. You can find the podcast anywhere you find your podcasts. And obviously you found it since you're listening, so thank you for that. If you are interested in helping out the show just a little bit, please take 30 seconds and go on over to wherever you are listening to this podcast and rate the podcast. Help spread the word of Leadership Voyage by putting a rating wherever you are listening to the podcast. More ratings means more people will potentially learn about the show. So thank you in advance for that. In today's episode, it's going to be another one of these short ones that I've been doing this season about stuff I've read that I found interesting and want to pass along to you. Maybe save you a couple of minutes by not having to seek out something interesting to read. The link to this story is in the show notes wherever you are listening. So this one I want to talk about today, and today is April 11th, 2023, but this story is from just a couple of weeks ago, March 28th, 2023, in the Wall Street Journal. And the author is Courtney Vinopal. That's Vinopal. I hope I'm pronouncing that close. Courtney Vinopal. And the article is called Knowing Everyone's Salaries Can Light a Fire Under Workers. Seeing a career path to advancement and believing the process is fair motivates employees, studies show. And first off, I want to say this is a topic I don't think I've ever talked about or talked to any guest about, honestly, even indirectly, is pay. I don't think that's really come up. So I found this a really interesting story. First, a shout out to the author, Courtney, because there are a lot of stories referenced in this article. Many studies. Sorry, I think I said stories. Many studies linked externally from this article. So if you want to dive deeply into any of the studies, jump on in. There's a 43-page study from January. There is something by Zoe Cullen at the National Bureau of Economic Research. That's a 35-page study. And a lot of these are referenced inside of this Wall Street Journal story to make it more digestible for us. But the headline for all of the information put together, and there are some details and exceptions and so on, which we can step through. But the bottom line from this story is that when salaries are known within an organization, when we have more pay transparency, they're seeing that that will motivate people under certain conditions, which is really interesting. I think this is a controversial topic. I think where I live in Colorado, when you post a job, it is required that you post a pay range. So whether you show a job's salary range or not as like a big table in the organization to all the people who work somewhere, whether or not you do that, when you post a job and it has to have that pay range, employees can read that job opening and will see the pay range. So there's a certain level of information that employees will glean because of this legislation. That's in Colorado, New York City, California, and elsewhere. But there's also another layer to this discussion, which is, should an organization not only show the range, but what happens if they show how much people are making? In other words, not just, oh, you do this job and you do that job, and this is the range for that job. But person A makes this amount and person B makes that amount. And I think that's where this word transparency becomes more relevant. There's publishing pay ranges, salary ranges for a job, and then there's being transparent in actually showing how much people are making. And that is something that I think a lot of people are uncomfortable talking about. And I think that's okay. It's very interesting. So back to the story. In this Wall Street Journal write-up, again, the link is in the show notes. It starts off talking about how when you have increased pay transparency, employees will work harder as long as they believe that the system around the pay is fair. As long as they perceive it as fair, people will work harder. And again, this is according to several new studies that are linked in the article. As I just said a minute ago, there are many different places in the U.S. here in particular. I don't know much about other places around the globe. I do apologize for that. If you want to chime in on this topic, please email me. Let me know wherever you're from and what's going on with the norms around pay transparency where you live. I'd love to hear about it. But, we got new laws in New York City, California. Like I said, Colorado has had this law for a little over a year. Have to publish the salary range for a position. And, even it also calls out here that even when a state isn't requiring salary ranges to be published, because there are many jobs that show these pay ranges, Indeed.com, for example, is often creating its own salary estimate, even when the company isn't providing. So I think the ultimate fear for all of us, for many of us, which is what is also pointed out in this write-up, is that we can be worried that if we know what our colleagues make, it could create tension and hurt performance. But again, what's really interesting here is when employees have found out how their salary compares to their peers, it can drive them to work harder. I'm going to get into a study here in a second that is called out in this article, but I want to make a quick aside about something that struck me when I read this article for the first time. Is it seems dissonant with some of the work that Daniel Pink has made well known over the last decade or however long it has been now around, the three drivers of performance being autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And also even showing that when you put money out as a reward, an extrinsic motivator in front of someone for complex tasks, their performance goes down. Now, I'll say it again in case some of you listening aren't familiar with this from Daniel Pink. When you put a monetary reward in front of someone, do this task really well, and I'll give you extra money or I'll give you a bonus or whatever that looks like. If it's a complex task, performance goes down. The idea here is when you're doing complex work, you're driven by autonomy, mastery, and purpose, and not by extrinsic motivators. Check it out if you haven't heard about it or you're not familiar. But what struck me here is it's not exactly the same situation. Daniel Pink's talking about autonomy, mastery, and purpose and how people's performance going down when you try to incentivize them with rewards that way. It's not exactly the same as pay transparency, but I did find it interesting that when you disclose pay and and people think it's fair, that the performance can go up. So I found those two things a little dissonant in my own brain. I don't know what you think about that, but I found a relationship between those that I found interesting. So in this article, the author talks about there were some studies about pay transparency in public universities several years ago that in the academic setting, they kind of messed around with this a little bit. And it was interesting because when pay was made public or transparent to peers, like I know how much I make, I know how much you make, you know how much I make, and we're doing the same job, those who were paid on the high end in a peer group once they were seeing that pay compared to others, they would produce 7% more articles on average in the academic community. Now, interesting, I didn't dive into this super deeply, but it is referenced in the article. Just really interesting that some folks were driven to perform higher to kind of justify the fact that they were paid more compared to their peers. It's a pretty interesting angle. What it also calls out, though, was that when this pay transparency in the academic setting showed inequity, productivity went down. Okay? So when that pay transparency was essentially perceived as unfair, you're doing that job, I'm doing the same job, I'm making a way more than you are, and you're seeing that as unfair, productivity decreased. And I think that's an interesting point. Another study called out in this article is one of a large commercial bank, which with over 2,000 employees, it found that these participants worked harder when they discovered that their manager made more money than they thought. Now that's one that's interesting. When folks learned how much their manager made, and it was more than they expected it to be, employees worked harder. However, when they found out that their peers earned more than they expected, again, what you think in your mind is, what your expectation is, and when that's kind of shattered is an emotional experience. When workers found out that their peers earned more than they thought, productivity decreased. So a lot of mixed messages here around the pay transparency. But the common theme called out in this story is when employees perceive it as fair, that the performance goes up. Near the end of this article, there's an anecdote that is shared from a cybersecurity company in California, and they started publishing their salary ranges earlier this year. And they talk about a specific example of an employee who learned that their range was 120 to 180,000. And they learned that they knew they were making 130,000. And that prompted a conversation. They went to their manager or to HR and said, hey, this is the range for the position. It's good to see that, but why am I paid on such a low end? And what they're saying here is that, yes, some of these conversations are uncomfortable, but by publishing the range, it's created a higher level of engagement around the topic. And even when it's a difficult conversation, a transparent conversation can talk directly about, hey, the range is 120 to 180, but you were recently promoted into this position. People who have been doing this position for a short period are going to tend to start on the lower end of the range. It doesn't necessarily mean anything about your performance other than you're new to the position and therefore lower in the range. And now it sets up a conversation to be clear about expectations around what does it look like to continue to advance. And that can lead to motivation, having clear expectations around what to do. And that's where I actually think that this pay transparency topic is potentially just a catalyst to some of Daniel Pink's research. So before, this employee made 130,000. Maybe they're happy with it, maybe they're not, I don't know, but they didn't know about a range. And then in earlier this year, their company publishes the range. It prompts this conversation, hey, why am I paid so low in the range? And what it does is it sets up a good discussion about expectations around what this employee probably needs to do in order to continue to master skills. And that motivation to have mastery, that can lead to really high performance. And so this whole thing kind of has me wondering if the pay transparency is also a catalyst when it's under a set of safe conditions. In another company, it says very similar in this article. There's a quote in here. It says, "It allowed us to start having really frank conversations with our staff. What it takes to make more money here and what skills you need to acquire in order to be promoted." So I walk away from this story in the Wall Street Journal about pay transparency thinking a lot of things. I hope it's inspired you to have a few thoughts about it. I wonder what it's like in your organization. I'd love to hear about it. An interesting topic, and I suspect that pay transparency will continue to gain more and more traction, especially if studies like these continue to come out. I hope you've been inspired to think a little bit about your situation in your company. Let me know what you're thinking. And until next time, and another episode of Leadership Voyage, everyone take care.